So the goal this morning, we'll see if we achieve that goal, is to get through the rest of the book of Psalms this morning, or at least our overview of the book of Psalms. And so last week, we discussed 5 categories of the book of Psalms. And we had our 5 categories were the Psalms of personal devotion to God. We had royal psalms, which focus on an Israelite king as a servant of God. We had psalms of thanksgiving, psalms of personal laments, and psalms of communal laments. And I'm going to actually back up. We looked at Psalms 150 and found that was a psalm of personal devotion to God. Then we looked at Psalm 44 and we found that that was a psalm of communal lament. Then we looked at Psalm 21 and found that that was one of the royal psalms talking about a king, in this case King David. So that leaves us 2 left. I wanted to show you which ones we had left so that we remember from last week. So next we're going to go to Psalm 38. And I'm going to start with Naomi. Why don't, Naomi, you get Psalm 38, verses 1 through 4.
O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. For your arrows have sunk into me, and your hand has come down on me. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There is no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me.
So we have, this is just a selection from this psalm. This is a Psalm of David. In my version, in the ESV version, it has a title on it. This would be a title that man has given it to it. Do not forsake me, O Lord. Which one of our 5 categories does this belong to?
Personal lament.
Yeah, this is a song of personal lament. David is speaking. Remember when we talked about communal laments, there was the pronouns we and us and our in there. Those are all plural. Like when we talk about, well, sometimes we use the word we to like a royal we, but we is usually more than one person. We talk about a group of people. Well, that's not used here. We have the pronoun me in verse 2. O Lord, rebuke, or in verse 1, O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, for your arrows have sunk into me, and your hands have come down on me. And so we have, this is a personal lament, and we talked about what a lament was last week. What was a lament, just so we remember what we're talking about?
Sorrow for something done.
Yeah, sorrow. Like a sorrow for something done or something that's occurring to us. And whether it's because of sin or whether that's because of trials that we're going through or whatever it is sorrow. And so we have a psalm of personal lament, Psalm 38, and there would be many other psalms that you could fit into this category. And so lastly, that brings us to Psalm 30. Bill, do you want to get Psalm 30, verses 4 to 6?
Sing praise to the Lord, you his godly ones, and give thanks to his holy name. For his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. Now, as for me, I said in my prosperity, I will never be moved.
Okay, so we have, again, what category would this fall into? We have one left.
Thankfulness.
Yeah, Thanksgiving. As far as Psalms of Thanksgiving, we had one left from what we had not done before. And I had selected these, well, Dave had selected these from the book, and I had selected them as Psalms that we could go. I think he had 2 or 3 for both, but we don't need to go through all of them. Sing praises to the Lord, O his saints, and give thanks to his holy name. We have Psalms of thanksgiving. And these are good Psalms to take a look when we want to think, all right, what should we be thankful for? We usually have Thanksgiving once a year. If you're Canadian and American, you might get it twice a year. You might celebrate it in October and November. But we should be thankful all the year. It's not just twice a year that we should set aside. Just like we shouldn't just set aside for remembering Jesus' death at what the world calls Easter. We remember Jesus' death every week. But there are times of thankfulness. And so let's see. Dave, I think it's David here. Yeah, it's a Psalm of David. He's talking about giving thanks to God. For his anger is but for a moment, but his favor for a lifetime. That's something to be thankful about. God's not always angry. We can find favor with God if we are righteous. He said, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes when the morning. We don't have to be a sad people all of the time. There are things to be sad over. But we should be a joyous people, a happy people. Sometimes we can focus on some of the trials that we face, and we do face them. But then we forget that there are joyful things, even in this world of sin and woe. There are joyful things, and we need to be joyful as well as when time comes to weep over things that need weeping. And so this is a psalm of thanksgiving. So these are our psalms. And so we have the content. We've come from 5 sections, which we discussed whether or not we're stretching a little bit on that. We have 5 categories of psalms, and as I said before, these aren't the only categories we could discuss. There were other things we could talk about. 5 categories. But also the content of psalm is the coming Messiah. There is a lot of psalms talking about the Messiah, talking about Jesus Christ that was going to come. And so our question that is posed is, what key aspects of the life of Christ are clearly spoken of in the book of Psalms? And we have these on the list. We're not going to go through all of them, or at least we're not going to read all of them. The first one is found in Psalms 2:7, and that talks about his sonship, how he is the Son of God, how he, as far as how he is God. And so if you take a look at Psalm 2:7 on your own time, and then Hebrews 1:5, those 2 verses correlate to each other. They are verses that where the writer comes along and makes the same point in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, we will get the second one, found in Psalms 16, verses 8 to 11. I think we're at least there. Psalm 16, verses 8 through 11.
I have said the Lord always before me, because he lifted my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope. For you will not leave my soul in shadow, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You will show me the path of life. In your presence, in fullness of joy, let your right hand uphold us forever.
This verse should sound familiar to us. This verse should sound familiar to us, especially if we've been paying attention in our study on Wednesday night. But when you read this psalm, if you had no verses in the New Testament, you might miss what is being talked about here. Or you might say it's not obvious that this was a messianic psalm. And that's true. Remember, as we said before, Paul said in Ephesians that prophecy was written in a mystery before, but now is being revealed. God didn't come right out and say, this is a messianic psalm, know this now. Now, the Jews did know about some messianic psalms. There was the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, they read the Old Testament. They knew what they were looking for. But not always was it so cut and dry, so black and white. Does anyone remember where this verse is quoted in the New Testament? Let's go to the book of Acts, chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, I think we're to Shudung. Do you want to get verses 27 and 28? Acts 2, verses 27 and 28.
For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence.
Okay, we could have gotten 20, starting at 25, where he says, "For David said concerning him," and we could have gotten all the way through. But it's the same phrasing. Now, Psalms uses the Sheol. In the Greek, the word is Hades. This is a difference between Hebrew and Greek, not because there's a difference. Sheol is the grave. Hades is the place of the dead. And so David is being quoted here by Peter. We know that Psalm 16 is a messianic psalm about the resurrection of Jesus Christ because Peter said so through the Holy Spirit. We do not have to guess and say, well, maybe this is Old Testament prophecy. No, David said Peter gave us inspired commentary on it. And because we have inspired commentary, we know what David was talking about, even though he was speaking in a mystery. And so that's one of the messianic psalms that we have. Dave has Psalm 22, verses 1 to 18 as another one. We're not going to read 1 to 18. We're going to read verse 1 and verse 16. I think we're to Henry. Do you want to get Psalm 22, verses 1 and 16? No, 1 and 16. Two verses. 1 and 16.
My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? And from the words of my groaning. 16. For dark hell was surrounding me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hand and my feet.
Again, I think we've discussed this one slightly before. Reading through this is a Psalm of David again. And we discussed the meaning of verse 1, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? We talked about it not being that God abandoned Jesus Christ, but that he allowed him to suffer. And if you read the entire psalm again, if we would have read 1 to 18, we'd find out that even David, and when he applies this to himself, trusted in God for deliverance. He did not believe the Lord had abandoned him, but he was allowed to suffer hardship. Jesus, again, this is one of those things where we know that this also applied to Jesus. It had a double meaning. In Matthew 27, I think we're to Cherry. Matthew 27, verse 46. Oh, sorry about. You want me to read it, and I'll get you next, because this has some hard words in it. Matthew 27, verse 46. And about the 9th hour cried out Jesus with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Jesus is quoting Psalm 22, verse 1. He's quoting it here. And again, as we discussed last week, I think, the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priests were quoting Psalm 22 back to him. When it talks about, you trusted in God, let God save you if he will have you. That was Psalm 22 as well. Jesus here is applying Psalm 22 to himself. Yes, it was a psalm of David, but this was also a psalm that was involved in his crucifixion. Jesus was not abandoned by God on the cross, but he was allowed to die on the cross for the remission of sins. Any comments before we move on to the next one? Well, if not, let's go to Psalm 41. And I think Cherry can get this one. Cherry, you want to read? Psalm 41, verse 9. So again, we have another psalm, Psalm 41, another psalm of David. Read through the entire psalm and say, well, I don't see it. I don't see where this is being, how this could be a psalm about Jesus too, except the book of John comes and deals with that. Let's go to John chapter 13. Annie, can you get John 13, verse 18?
And now speaking about it, I know whom I have seen. But it is fulfilled the scripture to run in that way, as beauty is against them.
This is talking about who? Who's the one who ate bread with Jesus and lifted his heel against him? Judas. This is another psalm. This is a psalm about his betrayal, or at least that comes and deals with his betrayal. Again, reading Psalm 41, you might not understand that from just reading the psalm. But Jesus says here, the scripture will be fulfilled. What scripture? Psalm 41, verse 9. He who ate bread has lifted up his heel against me. This is concerning his betrayal. So we have aspects of the life of Christ spoken in the book of Psalms, sometimes a little bit more cryptically than we might understand. But when we have New Testament coming along and either quoting it or saying it's fulfilling it, we can know what we're talking about. The last one, which we won't read, Psalm 110, verses 1 to 4, talks about his reign and his priesthood. Peter said in Acts 2, 34 and 35 that Christ was reigning then. He is king now. And in Hebrews chapter 7, we get about his priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. Remember, that's what that chapter is about. So we have these psalms, and there are others that we could discuss, that really talk about Jesus Christ. And we can see that throughout the Psalms. And since Dave has pointed out in every book, how does this relate to Jesus Christ? How does it do that? Well, Psalms is a very easy book to relate to Christ. Anything more before we move on? Jeff?
I always found it interesting that these prophecies, not just things that happen like randomly something is fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
They all fit within a purpose. Just random things, they have a purpose in what happens. People are impressed in the world when somebody predicts something that supposedly happens. It's always a random event.
Mm-hmm.
That really, like, what did I learn from that? I didn't learn anything. Speaking of Judas' betrayal, that's part of the life of Christ. It's one of the reasons he ended up on the cross, because his own friend betrayed him.
Yeah.
And he was on the cross to die for the sins of even the one who betrayed him.
Mm-hmm. And the ones who crucified him as well.
Right. These aren't just predictions, but they were prophecies of things that would have a purpose and a meaning.
That's true. And I might also say that they're not common events. I could predict it's going to rain, and I might be right. Meteorologists do that all the time. They predict it. And whether or not it comes to pass, that's depends on the weather. But we usually blame the weatherman when he's wrong, or we praise him when he's right, and he really had nothing to do with it. The weather is the weather. And we try to predict things that are common. But as Jeff said, these aren't common events that could easily be predictable, and they had a purpose. And they all played into the plan of God. This was God's plan all the way along, to save mankind through Jesus' death. And we'll deal with more about that in the lesson a little later. That brings us to the next part of Psalms. It deals with imprecatory psalms. And in the book, Dave explains this, but he doesn't on the PowerPoint. So we have to deal with something. And so I've created the question, what does imprecatory mean? Does anyone know what imprecatory means? And if you don't, that's fine.
calling of a curse.
What? Calling down curses? That's part of it, yeah. Calling down curses, invoking judgment, and calamity or curses upon one's enemy or the enemies of God. An example of this is found in Psalm 35. David, do you want to get Psalm 35, verse 8? Please and thank you. I think I was calling on you.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, sure.
I'm sorry.
Let destruction come upon him when he does not know it, and let the net that he hid ensnare him, let him fall into it to his destruction.
This is one of the examples of what is called an imprecatory psalm. It's a psalm that is calling on judgment or calamity or curses to fall on the enemies of oneself or the enemies of God. And there are other psalms, but this is one that I picked that just makes it so clear. Let destruction come upon him when he doesn't know it. Let the net that he hid ensnare him, and let him fall into it to his destruction. That is what an imprecatory psalm is, which will bring us to Dave's question. How do imprecatory psalms differ from... Well, that's not what I was looking for. Let's see if it's... That's the one I was looking for. I forgot to remove that one. How can the psalms of imprecation be reconciled with the commands to love one's enemy? Because the two seem to be at odds with each other. How can these two things be reconciled? Matthew 5:44, the Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies, do good to them that persecute you, and so on and so on. And then we have Psalms 109, verses 4 and 5, talks about judgment, or this is an imprecation again. How can we reconcile these two things? Do you have a thought, Bill? Or?
Well, yeah, I'm sure this is how you'd want it answered. Like sometimes I marvel at the amount of evil in the world and disrespect for God, and he allows it to continue. And at times, I feel angry, but I remind myself I can maybe feel angry at the attitude people are putting forth to God. Why are you allowing this, God? You're righteous, and yet this continues. But I can't have a vengeful attitude on those around me, those in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say, God destroyed them, they're wicked.
I think that last part is where we're really sort of going with that, about not being vengeful. When you talk about psalms of imprecation, you have to notice how the wording of the psalm is. What's the language being used? And we can get this. Let's go to Psalm 59, another psalm of imprecation. And I'd like us to see if we can notice something that is being said. Tim, would you want to get Psalm 59, verse 13?
Consume them in wrath, consume them, that they may not be, and let them know that God rules in Jacob to the ends of the earth. Selah.
What is the purpose of calling down imprecation here? Consume them in their wrath, consume them until they are no more. That's the imprecation part. That's the calling down of judgment or curse. What was the purpose? It's given in that verse.
So they'll know that God rules.
So that they will know that God rules. And so the imprecations are motivated not out of a sense of personal revenge. Not out of, okay, they've wronged me, therefore I want God to call down a curse so that I can get even. That's not what the desire is. The imprecations are motivated out of a desire for God to vindicate his own righteous character before the earth. There is a difference for that. God, what was the reason that the children of Israel received the promised land when they did? Why did they have to wait 400 years? What was the reason given to Abraham? Sins of the Amorites are not yet full. God doesn't destroy righteous people for the sake of destroying righteous people. That doesn't mean bad things won't happen to them. But he doesn't punish for sin the righteous people because they are righteous, as we discussed last week. We live in a world that calamities happen, but we must not remember to call down curses on God for something that happens to us, because that's not necessarily true. But when the children of Israel took the promised land in Joshua, you think those people knew who God was? Look at the children of Israel compared to the stature of Jericho. The walls of Jericho come tumbling down. Not because Israel took chisels and hammers to it and destroyed it. No, they came tumbling down. They marched around the city. And the trumpets blew. And the walls came tumbling down. Think those people would have known who God was? Yes, they would have known who God was. And so, imprecations are motivated a desire for God to vindicate his righteous character. It also is out of a desire to expose the wicked, so that all will acknowledge and praise the true God of heaven. So, when these calls of judgment come down, it's so that the wicked lifestyle of the world can be exposed for what it is, wickedness. God does not always do that, but it is not wrong for God to do that. Our society has become very wicked. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily more wicked than generations gone by. We seem to we seem to always want to go back to generations gone by as if those generations were perfect. They weren't perfect. But it seems like our generation is exceptionally evil, and I tend to blame the things that we like. The technology that we have exposes us to it a lot more. We can find things and hear news about things that goes on far across countries. We wouldn't hear those things 200 years ago, maybe for months or years. We wouldn't hear those things because information didn't travel via social media, via the internet, via television. And so we would only have the knowledge of what immediately goes on around us. But today we can know what's going on in Africa. We can know what's going on in Europe. We can know what's going on in South America. And we can know what's going on in British Columbia, Canada. And we take a look at the earth today and we say, it is just so wicked. And it is. Let's not downplay it. It is so wicked. But that means the gospel needs to be spread because the world is so wicked. The gospel needs to go out. We need to try to bring people to Christ, to try to leave their wickedness behind. But one of the reasons for these psalms is so that God will expose the wickedness. Because remember, Jesus said, or I don't know whether it's Jesus or forget, but anyway, the light exposes the darkness. If we want to find out what is wrong, you shed light on it. Like as far as if you're in a dark room, turn the light on. Have a flashlight, have a torch, whatever it is, you can brighten the room. What's the light that we can use to expose the wickedness of the world? It's the Scriptures. Scriptures will expose the wickedness of the world, and hopefully will turn some away from the wickedness of the world. So, some of the reasons for this is, again, to expose wickedness. Another reason for imprecation of these psalms, it is out of a desire for all men to see the merciful hand of God, delivering the righteous from the oppression of the wicked. This is not just, this is not just punishment and judgment for the sake of punishment and judgment. This is to show that God will deliver the righteous. It tells us that it's better to be righteous because God will deliver them. Whether he delivers them in our physical life or not, that's up for God. In the book of Daniel, I was studying Daniel on Thursday night in my class on Thursday night, and we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were standing before Nebuchadnezzar because they didn't bow down to the image. They said, "Our God is able to deliver us from you, from your hand." Now, whether or not God chose to save Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace was up to him, and we know he did. But those three men said, God is able to deliver us. He is able to do that. But if he chooses not to, we will not bow down to your image. God would have, if God had not saved those three men from the fiery furnace, he would have still delivered them out of this life. They still would have received the promised reward for those who are righteous. And so part of these Psalms is to show, okay, this is a wicked world, but God's not going to destroy you if you're righteous. He's going to be able to deliver you if you're righteous. So go and be righteous. That's part of the reasons. And the last thing, it is out of a desire for just judgment of a perfectly righteous God. Let's face it, our judgment is not always righteous. Our judgment is far from perfect. We sometimes, that's 2 minutes. We sometimes judge things that are right that turn out to be wrong. We sometimes judge things that are wrong that turn out to be right. We judge people wrongly. Not only in our personal lives, but in our court systems too. God is just. God's judgment is righteous every time. These are the purpose for the Psalms of Imprecation. Any comments? Jeff?
Just briefly, I looked at that because of that passage in Matthew chapter 5 recently, and I found one in Psalms, I can't remember where it is. But speaking of God's hate for his enemy, David said himself, "Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? Do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies." Sometimes we have some difficulty, like you said, putting those together, to love our enemy and hate our enemy. But as you've shown, it's a love that's doing good for others, even though they do wrong against you. But we still have to do both in hate. In other words, be against those who do wrong. We have to stand firmly on the other side. We cannot try to be on their side to try and be friendly with them, to encourage them to know the truth. We have to understand where they are is on the other side of God. They are away from God and they're turned away from him. God hates that, but he still loves them at the same time. And it's difficult for us to be able to accept both.
And I note it's a perfect hatred. It's not an emotional hatred. Perfect hatred is a complete hatred. There is a righteous hatred, just as there's a righteous jealousy of God. But it's not an emotional one, carried away from that. So that brings us to our outline. I know that I'm just about out of time, and I wanted to end early today. But we have our outline. And remember, the book of Psalms is 5 books divided into one, or combined into one. We have Psalms 1 through Psalms 41, that's book 1. Psalms 42 to 72 is book 2. Psalms 73 to 89 is book 3. Psalms 90 to 106 is book 4. And Psalms 107 to 150 is book 5. All of them contain all of those different divisions that we talked about. They contain psalms of thanksgiving, psalms of personal lament and communal lament, royal psalms, and what was the third, fourth, fifth one? Tried to quote it and lost it. Psalms of thanksgiving, I think is the one I missed. They all contain those, but there are 5 books written by all those authors we talked about. Many are written by David, but others are written by other people. Psalms covers all aspects of the relationship between God and his followers. Psalms also serves as a guide for the devotional needs and expressions of an individual in his relationship to God. And Psalms also emphasizes Christ as the Savior of the world, making that relationship possible through his death on the cross. That is the book of Psalms in a nutshell. It's 4 weeks that we've spent on it. And I encourage you to read the different Psalms. I often put in the bulletin encouraging words ripped right from scriptures. Those are from the Psalms because there are encouraging words in Psalms. So I encourage you to read them. They're not all of them are so long. Some of them are quite short. They make good devotional readings, and they teach us important lessons.